June 15, 1942, Murmansk front. Gray mist rolls over the Arctic harbor, swallowing the sound of the sirens until only the wind remains. Below, the docks shudder under German bombs. Above, 6 unfamiliar fighters rise from the ice-crusted runway, squat-nosed, green-painted machines with red stars on their tails and English lettering still stenciled on the wings. The men flying them are young Soviet pilots from the 19th Guards Regiment, trained on something new, an American machine the British had already laughed at and cast aside. Bell P-39 Airacobras. They've been told it's slow, it's heavy, and it can't climb. But at 2,000 meters those doubts vanish. The 37mm cannon in the nose thunders once, then again, and a German Ju-88 bomber falls apart in midair. 5 minutes later, 9 German aircraft are gone. The Soviets land without a loss. And somewhere in the Luftwaffe's after-action report, a note appears for the first time. American fighters used by the Russians. No one in Washington notices. Not yet. Because few in the West believe that the Airacobra, the fighter everyone mocked, has just begun rewriting its own story. The story of the P-39 Airacobra begins not in battle, but in a drawing room at the Bell Aircraft Corporation in Buffalo, New York, in the late 1930s. The United States Army Air Corps had just issued a challenge, a call for a new, high-speed interceptor that could outclimb and outgun anything in the world. 1938 was the year of rapid change. Europe trembled toward war, and American designers still worked in a world untouched by combat reality. At Bell, a small, ambitious team led by Larry Bell and engineer Bob Woods decided to gamble everything on a radical design. They would move the engine, the powerful Allison V1710, from the nose to a position directly behind the pilot. It would drive the propeller through a long shaft running under the cockpit floor. The empty nose would hold something extraordinary, a 37mm cannon firing straight through the propeller hub. No fighter in the world had ever been armed like that. The concept looked revolutionary on paper. The Airacobra, as it would later be called, promised incredible firepower, a clean aerodynamic nose, and an advanced tricycle landing gear that made takeoffs safer and gave pilots better visibility on the ground. Its cockpit doors even opened like a car's, a novelty that felt almost luxurious. In 1939, the first prototype, the XP-39, streaked across test fields in New York. Early data hinted at greatness, top speeds over 390 miles per hour and superb handling near the ground. But then came the fatal compromise. To reach those speeds, Bell had used a turbo supercharger, a device that forced air into the engine at high altitude, maintaining power where the air thinned. The Army engineers, nervous about reliability and cost, ordered it removed after a round of NACA wind tunnel testing. The redesign simplified production, but it also crippled the fighter above 12,000 feet. It was a decision made in peacetime, long before anyone understood how quickly the skies over Europe would rise into high-altitude killing zones. By the time the modified YP-39 prototypes appeared in 1940, the aircraft was already behind the curve. Britain's new Spitfires and Germany's Messerschmitt Bf-109s could climb higher, faster, and still fight hard at 25,000 feet. The Airacobra, robbed of its turbocharger, now excelled only at low level, a trait no one thought valuable for modern air combat. Still, the British were desperate for fighters. In early 1941, the Royal Air Force ordered hundreds of the American machines, designating them Airacobra I. When the first shipments arrived, pilots of No. 601 Squadron tested them over England's south coast. They liked the visibility. They liked the landing gear. They admired the cannon. But the moment they tried to fight German bombers above 20,000 feet, the verdict was brutal. The Airacobra couldn't climb fast enough to intercept, its engine lost power, it stalled in vertical turns. The RAF flew a single operational mission and quietly withdrew the type. British mechanics joked that Airacobra was the wrong name, they called it Iron Cobra, a snake that could not rise. The rejection hurt. Bell had invested prestige and national pride into the project. American press releases had promised a world-beating fighter, Yet the reality was an aircraft that the Allies themselves didn't want. When U.S. pilots finally tested it, their impressions weren't kinder. One described it as a good airplane for someone else's war. But those words held a strange kind of truth. Because the Airacobra was designed for someone else's war, one that the United States didn't yet understand. In 1940 and 1941, American doctrine still envisioned short-range interceptors defending cities, naval bases, or advancing armies. Nobody was thinking about 6-hour bomber escorts across France or deep penetration raids into Germany. For those tasks, a low-altitude cannon fighter seemed irrelevant. Yet history was about to prove that no design, however flawed, is wasted forever. Somewhere far to the east, another air war was forming, one fought at treetop height, in freezing haze, where engagements lasted seconds and the enemy appeared at 100 meters. In that kind of war, the Airacobra's weaknesses would vanish. Its heavy-nose cannon, once mocked as excessive, would become its deadliest virtue. But in 1940, nobody could see that far ahead. The U.S. Army Air Corps quietly placed orders anyway, more to keep production lines alive than out of confidence. Bell built hundreds of aircraft that would sit in storage, waiting for a war to give them purpose. When that war finally arrived at Pearl Harbor, America found itself unprepared and short on fighters. The Airacobra, flawed, misunderstood, and unwanted, was suddenly thrust into service. And that's where its second chapter begins. The winter of 1941 turned America's forgotten prototypes into war machines overnight. Pearl Harbor burned, Wake Island fell, and across the Pacific, the Japanese Zero reigned uncontested. The United States needed fighters immediately, any fighters. Stored Airacobras meant for Britain suddenly found themselves relabeled. P-400's rushed onto ships and sent to the South Pacific. Many still bore British-style gauges and Imperial units, confusing American pilots who barely had time to train before combat. When they arrived at Guadalcanal in mid-1942, their shortcomings became brutally clear. The P-39 and P-400 could climb fast to 10,000 feet, but after that, the Allison engine gasped for air. Japanese bombers came from higher altitudes. Zeros, light and agile, dove on the P-39's with terrifying speed. American pilots joked bitterly that their new fighter's name, P-400, stood for a P-40 with a zero on its tail. Yet even here, amid the mud and malaria, the Airacobra showed a hint of hidden strength. It could dive hard without falling apart. Its tricycle landing gear handled the rough jungle strips others feared. And that nose cannon, 37 millimeters of solid steel punch, could tear a bomber to shreds in a single burst. When it hit, it really hit. Still, U.S. commanders weren't impressed. The Airacobra was soon replaced by P-38's and P-40's for frontline duty. For America, it was a dead-end design. But 6,000 miles away, another nation was desperate for exactly what America was throwing away. The Soviet Union had entered its second year of a war unlike any in history. From the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, German dive bombers and fighters ruled the skies. The Red Air Force had lost thousands of aircraft in the first months after Operation Barbarossa. Soviet pilots fought bravely, but many flew obsolete machines, slow, lightly armed biplanes or underpowered monoplane designs. When the U.S. Lend-Lease Act opened the floodgates, hundreds of Airacobras were quietly loaded onto ships in Alaska, bound for Vladivostok and Murmansk. Britain didn't want them. America didn't need them. But the Soviets were willing to try anything that could fly and fire. At first, Soviet pilots were skeptical. The layout was strange: an engine behind the cockpit, car-style side doors, a nose cannon that shook the whole airframe when fired. Mechanics found English labels and imperial measurements confusing. But then came the first test flights. The P-39 climbed quickly to low altitudes, turned sharply, and fired a devastating central cannon, exactly the kind of weapon needed to break up German bomber formations. Most air battles on the Eastern Front took place under 15,000 feet, sometimes below 3,000. At those heights, the Airacobra's missing turbocharger didn't matter. What mattered was rugged construction, concentrated firepower, and a clear view from the cockpit, all things it had in abundance. Soviet tacticians began to realize something the West had missed. This was not a high-altitude interceptor. It was a night fighter. In 1942, the first Airacobra-equipped Soviet units went into action in the far north, defending convoys bringing Allied supplies to Murmansk. German Ju-88 bombers and Bf-109 escorts attacked daily, assuming superiority. But to their surprise, the squad American fighter held its own. Within months, P-39's were credited with hundreds of shootdowns across the Arctic sector. By 1943, whole regiments had converted to the type. The 19th Guards Fighter Regiment, 16th Guards, and later the 9th Guards were all equipped with Airacobras. The planes carried distinctive red stars but kept their American serials, a strange fusion of two worlds. One pilot in particular became synonymous with the P-39, Alexander Pokrishkin, a methodical tactician and brilliant leader. He had already scored victories in Soviet aircraft, but when handed an Airacobra, he found a machine that matched his style perfectly. He called it a fighter of the future, balanced, stable, and built for precision flying. Pokrishkin personally retrained his men, teaching energy tactics, coordinated dives, and radio-controlled formations unheard of in older Soviet doctrine. And when his squadron first met German fighters over the Caucasus and Kuban in 1943, the results were astonishing. The Germans had heard of the Airacobra, mocked it even. They considered it slow, heavy, and unsuited for modern war. But in Soviet hands, its low-altitude firepower became a nightmare for bombers and fighter-bombers alike. The Western world, meanwhile, barely noticed. To American journalists, the Airacobra remained a failed design. To Soviet pilots, it was a lifeline, a machine that could finally hold the sky. And so, while in the Pacific it had been a joke, in the East it became legend. By the end of 1942, trains and ships were delivering thousands more. Nearly half of all P-39's ever built would fly under the Red Star. In the frozen North and the burning South, a transformation had begun. The fighter no one wanted was becoming the one the Germans feared to meet. The Bell P-39 was an aircraft defined by contradiction. On paper, it should have been a disaster. Its Allison engine lacked a turbocharger. Its performance dropped sharply above 12,000 feet. It was heavy in turns and prone to losing control in steep climbs. But under 6,000 meters, it transformed into something else entirely, a low-altitude predator with remarkable balance and control. In Soviet skies, where battles unfolded barely above the treetops, that transformation mattered. The Airacobra's tricycle landing gear allowed it to take off from rough frontline fields, strips of frozen dirt, cratered asphalt, or summer mud. Its long nose gave superb visibility in combat, and its central gun, the M4 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, gave it killing power unmatched by most fighters of the era. A single shell could tear a bomber wing in half or shatter an armored engine block. Soviet mechanics quickly learned how to tune the Allison engine for maximum low-altitude thrust, while pilots exploited its stability in dives and rolls. The Airacobra could hold a steady gun platform better than most Yak or La series fighters. It could absorb punishment and still bring its pilot home. At low altitudes, where Luftwaffe bombers and fighter bombers prowled, these traits flipped the script. What the Americans saw as dead weight, the Soviets saw as armor and precision. The Airacobra's flaws vanished at tree level, replaced by a brutal, dependable strength. It wasn't the fastest or the highest flyer. But at the altitude that mattered most over the Eastern Front, it was the one aircraft that always hit hard and came back alive. When the first P-39's arrived, the Red Air Force was still recovering from catastrophic losses in 1941. Soviet pilots were brave, but doctrine lagged years behind Germany's. Tight V formations and rigid command structures often turned squadrons into easy prey for flexible Luftwaffe pairs. The Airacobra's arrival coincided with a revolution in Soviet aerial tactics. Experienced frontline pilots began adopting new ideas: wide separation, altitude layering, coordinated energy fighting. And leading that change was Alexander Pokrishkin. He studied the Airacobra's flight envelope like an engineer. He saw that it could outroll the Bf-109 at low speed, dive faster without flutter, and accelerate hard from 1,000 to 3,000 meters, the zone where most German bombers operated. Pokryshkin taught his men to climb just below the enemy's altitude, strike from the side or rear, and escape in a shallow dive that the Germans couldn't match. He also introduced strict radio discipline, something Soviet units had rarely used. His voice from the cockpit of a P-39 became a command network in the air. Height 300, right wing, fire! Short, precise bursts that turned chaos into coordination. The Airacobra wasn't just a weapon, it was a teacher. Its reliable controls and clear cockpit made it the perfect training ground for advanced tactics. Within months, Pokryshkin's regiment was pioneering layered formations that combined yaks and cobras in vertical traps. The Germans, accustomed to predictable Soviet responses, suddenly faced an enemy that anticipated their moves. The P-39 fit that new doctrine perfectly: stable, powerful, and deadly at low level. It was no longer a misfit. It was the blueprint for a smarter, deadlier Soviet Air Force. Machines win headlines, but men win wars. The Airacobra's transformation into a Soviet legend was written not by engineers, but by pilots who refused to accept what others dismissed. Alexander Pokryshkin became the symbol of that defiance. Between 1942 and 1945, he scored 59 confirmed kills, 47 of them in a P-39. His combat reports read like engineering diagrams, every maneuver, every altitude change, every second logged with scientific precision. He saw the sky as geometry, and the P-39 as his instrument. It demanded discipline, he wrote. If you respected it, it would never betray you. Grigory Rechkalov, his wingman and sometimes rival, recorded 44 of his 56 victories in the same machine. Dmitry Glinka and his brother Boris followed with dozens more. In total, more than half of the top 10 Soviet aces of World War II flew the Airacobra for most of their careers. They loved it for the same reason others hated it: it rewarded precision. A sloppy pilot could lose control in a spin, a calm, technical one could dominate a duel. On the ground, mechanics treated the P-39 with reverence. They called it Kobrushka, Little Cobra. Its engine sat behind the pilot, close enough that they said it growled in your back. Crews often painted names, stars, or dedications to fallen comrades across its nose. Each plane became personal, almost sacred. These men trusted an aircraft that no one else had trusted, and together they rewrote its destiny. By 1943, Soviet Airacobra regiments were rewriting kill ratios across the Southern Front. Yet to truly understand how the Germans went from mocking the P-39 to fearing it, we have to look through the enemy's eyes, and at the hard numbers that told the truth no propaganda could hide. At first, Luftwaffe pilots barely noticed the new arrivals. Reports from the Arctic and Southern fronts in 1942 mentioned American types, only in passing, often dismissively. The German assumption was simple: if the Allies didn't use these planes themselves, they couldn't be worth much. That illusion shattered over Murmansk. The 19th Guards Fighter Regiment, flying newly delivered P-39's, was tasked with defending Allied convoys bringing fuel and ammunition into the Soviet north. On June 15, 1942, 6 of these, inferior, fighters intercepted a mixed formation of Ju-88 bombers and Bf-109 escorts. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, 9 German aircraft were down, and not a single Airacobra was lost. German after-action reports began to change tone. Pilots described fast climbing. Stub-nosed American fighters. That hit was shocking firepower. Luftwaffe intelligence began tagging the type as Cobra, a nod to its speed at low altitude and the deadly accuracy of its 37mm cannon. By late 1942, more of these Cobras appeared across the Southern Front. Near Stalingrad, Kuban, and the Caucasus, they defended Soviet ground forces with fierce persistence. German bomber crews dreaded their attacks: short, sudden, brutal. A single cannon hit often meant the end of the aircraft. Soon, Luftwaffe pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged low-altitude duels with Airacobras. Many ignored the warning, and paid for it. The mockery had ended. Respect, and fear, had taken its place. By the end of the war, 9,558 Airacobras had been built. Of those, 4,773 were shipped to the Soviet Union, nearly half of all production. No other American fighters served in such numbers with a foreign air force. Western pilots, who flew only a few hundred, often remembered it as underpowered and outdated. Soviet pilots, who flew thousands, saw something very different. According to wartime archives and later declassified records, Soviet Airacobra units claimed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed between 1942 and 1945. Losses, including combat and accidents, totaled around 1,000 aircraft, a staggering exchange rate for a plane the West had abandoned. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. Out of the top 10 Soviet aces, 5 scored most of their victories in P-39's. Pokrishkin's 47, Rechkalov's 44, Glinka's 50, and others added up to hundreds of kills. When American evaluators later reviewed combat data, they found something striking. In Soviet hands, the P-39 achieved a higher victory ratio than most contemporary Allied fighters. The reason wasn't magic. It was matchup. Where the Western air forces fought at 25,000 feet, the Soviets fought at 5,000. Where the RAF chased bombers over the Channel, the Red Air Force hunted Stukas over trenches. The P-39 wasn't a failed interceptor, it was a purpose-built low-altitude destroyer that had simply been misplaced by geography. And once placed in the right hands, in the right sky, it became one of the deadliest Allied fighters of the entire war. Ask most people today what the Airacobra did for the Soviets, and many will say, tank busting. It's one of the longest-living myths of World War II. The image of a heavy, nose cannon fighter strafing German panzers feels right, but history says otherwise. Combat records, gun camera footage, and pilot testimonies tell a different story. Soviet Airacobra units were rarely assigned to ground attack roles. That job belonged to the rugged IL-2 Sturmovik. The P-39's real mission was air superiority, clearing the skies over Soviet formations, hunting bombers, and intercepting low-level raiders. Even the ammunition tells the truth. The Airacobra's 37mm cannon could fire armor-piercing rounds, but Soviet crews loaded mostly high-explosive shells, designed to shred aluminum and fuel tanks, not pierce steel. Pokrishkin himself called the tank killer reputation nonsense. Our Cobras guarded the front, he said. They fought Messerschmitts, not tanks. So how did the myth spread? Post-war Western writers, unaware of Soviet doctrine and eager to rationalize the strange mid-engine layout, assumed the cannon was for ground attack. The truth, buried behind the Iron Curtain, stayed hidden for decades. When Soviet archives opened in the 1990s, historians finally saw the full picture. The P-39 wasn't a strike aircraft. It was a frontline defender, a low-altitude hunter, the right weapon for a brutal, close-range air war. In the eyes of the world, it was still America's worst fighter. But to the men who flew under red stars, it was the guardian of the front, a steel cobra that bit hard and survived the winter. And by 1943, its legend would be sealed in one of the most decisive air battles on the Eastern Front, the skies above the Kuban bridgehead, where German arrogance met Soviet precision, and the Airacobra proved that laughter could die as fast as a plane in flames. The winter of 1942 had broken the back of the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, but the German army was far from defeated. By early 1943, Hitler's generals were desperate to stabilize the front and regain control of the southern skies. Their solution was the Kuban bridgehead, a fortified strip of land between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, stretching across the Taman Peninsula. It was meant to shield retreating forces from Stalingrad and secure a launch point for future counterattacks. But to hold it, the Luftwaffe had to rule the air. Opposing them, the Red Air Force had learned its lessons in blood. No longer a disorganized swarm, it was now a coordinated machine. And at the heart of that transformation stood several Guards fighter regiments armed with an aircraft most German intelligence still dismissed, the Bell P-39 Airacobra. The Kuban campaign would change that forever. From March to June 1943, more than 1,200 aircraft fought over the Taman Peninsula. Messerschmitt Bf-109gs, Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, Stukas, and Heinkel bombers against an expanding Soviet air fleet of Yaks, La-5s, and hundreds of P-39's. The battles raged daily above marshes, rivers, and the Caucasus foothills. Some days saw over 1,000 sorties. Pilots sometimes fought 3 engagements before sunset. The Germans began the campaign confident. They believed their high-altitude advantage and superior climb rates would guarantee control. Soviet fighters, they assumed, would remain tethered to the ground, defending columns and convoys. They were wrong. By now, Alexander Pokrishkin's 16th Guards Fighter Regiment had transformed aerial combat into a science. Each pilot memorized a mental map of altitude, steps, layers of engagement zones where Cobras, Yaks, and La-5s operated in precise vertical tiers. The Airacobras, with their superior dive acceleration and stable gun platforms, formed the backbone of the trap. Every morning before takeoff, Pokrishkin drew chalk diagrams on the side of a fuel truck, arcs, spirals, and arrows, explaining angles of attack and escape. His pilots studied them in silence. There were no inspirational speeches, no theatrics. Just mathematics and calm confidence. The P-39's would climb to around 3,000 meters, a comfortable height for the Allison engine. Above them, Yaks acted as bait, luring German fighters into dives. Below, La-5s covered the deck, waiting for bombers that slipped through. The result was a 3-tiered ambush, simple on paper, devastating in the air. The first test came on April 8, 1943. German formations, bombers escorted by Bf-109gs, approached the front lines to strike Soviet supply depots near the Kuban River. As the bombers descended, Pokrishkin's Airacobras fell upon them from the side, not from above. Their entry angle was unorthodox, shallow and fast, slicing into the bomber stream rather than diving through it. At 400 meters, Pokrishkin fired his 37mm cannon once. A Heinkel disintegrated mid-air. His wingmen followed, each attack lasting no more than 2 seconds. German escort pilots dove after them, but the Airacobras had already slipped away into cloud. Within minutes, 3 bombers and 2 Bf-109's were gone. That evening, Luftwaffe command at Anapa radioed Berlin that enemy aircraft of American type are executing disciplined ambushes and diving escapes. Pilot skill is exceptional. Over the next weeks, these engagements multiplied. The Soviets flew thousands of sorties, sometimes 50 in a single day per regiment. The Germans soon realized that every time they entered the Kuban airspace below 5,000 meters, they were being watched, stalked by patient Airacobra units waiting for the right moment. The P-39's heavy cannon made them perfect for breaking bomber formations. Unlike machine-gun-armed fighters, they didn't need to linger. A short, controlled burst could cripple a twin-engine aircraft instantly. The gun's recoil, violent enough to jolt the entire plane, became a signature of its lethality. Soviet pilots learned to brace their shoulders, fire in 1-second bursts, and then dive away through the falling debris. By the end of April, Pokrishkin and his regiment had claimed more than 200 confirmed kills. German air control over the bridgehead began to crumble. Luftwaffe ace Gunther Rahl would later write that the Russians came at us in disciplined groups, their Cobras striking from nowhere, and disappearing before we could react. But the true turning point was still coming, one battle that would cement the Airacobra's reputation and forever silence those who called it a failure. For that, the calendar turned to May, and the skies over the Kuban burned white with sunlight and gunfire. May 1943. The Kuban bridgehead shimmered under the southern sun, a narrow strip of land between 2 seas, thick with smoke and dust. German divisions below fought to hold the line, but the real battle was above them. Dozens of aircraft tangled daily in a sky of heat haze and tracer fire, where the color of victory was always black and burning. That month, the Luftwaffe launched a massive offensive to regain aerial control. New Focke-Wulf 190's arrived, boasting better speed and climb than the old Bf-109's. Their mission was simple: crush Soviet air resistance, sweep the P-39's from the sky, and clear the way for Stukas and Ju-88s to bomb Soviet supply routes. The Soviets answered with silence and a trap. On the morning of May 12, the German bombers approached over the river delta, glinting silver in the early light. Pokrishkin's 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, flying P-39's, lay hidden in clouds below 3,000 meters. His voice cut across the radio calmly. "Third echelon, hold altitude. Second, prepare to climb. First, attack when I fire." Moments later, a line of black dots appeared through the mist. Ju-88s, perfectly aligned, escorted by a swarm of Messerschmitts. Pokrishkin waited until the bombers began their descent, timing his move to perfection. Then he pushed the throttle forward. The P-39's Allison engine roared as the nose dipped and the world blurred. The Airacobras dropped from the cloud layer like stones, gathering speed with terrifying force. The tricycle gear design, so odd-looking on the ground, gave the aircraft unusual balance in a high-speed dive. It didn't wobble, didn't roll, just cut. Pokrishkin's first target filled his gun sight, a lead bomber banking into formation. He fired one shell. The 37mm cannon recoiled like a hammer, shaking the entire cockpit. The shell struck the bomber's engine block. A flash, then a spray of black smoke. His wingman, Captain Rechkalov, struck next, firing short bursts that ripped through the second bomber's wing root. Another fireball. The Germans panicked. Some dropped their bombs early, others broke formation, scattering into evasive turns. Now came the escorts. Bf-109s dove from above, confident they could outclimb and outturn the heavy American fighter. But they underestimated the Airacobra's dive power. The Soviets didn't climb to meet them, they let the Germans fall past, then rolled sharply and attacked from below. In one exchange, Sergeant Dmitry Glinka executed a perfect high-G roll under a diving Messerschmitt, firing a single burst that shattered the Germans' tail assembly. It was a textbook energy trap, one of the first ever recorded in Soviet combat doctrine. Within 6 minutes, the air was chaos. Cobras streaked through bomber formations, heavy cannon bursts echoing over the coast. German pilots radioed frantic warnings of thick-nosed American types attacking from impossible angles. Ground observers later reported aircraft falling, like sparks from a furnace, across 20 kilometers of sky. By the end of the engagement, the Luftwaffe had lost 13 bombers and 7 fighters. Pokrishkin's regiment suffered no losses. That battle, later known simply as Pokrishkin's ambush, broke German confidence in the Kuban sector. For the first time, Luftwaffe units avoided direct engagement at low altitude. They climbed higher, hoping to fight in thinner air where the Cobras struggled. But every time they dove down to strike ground targets, the Cobras were waiting. Over the next 2 weeks, Soviet Airacobras claimed another 100 confirmed kills, forcing German command to shift tactics entirely. The Kuban front became the proving ground for a new Soviet air strategy, flexible, layered, and deadly precise. For the Germans, the psychological blow was as deep as the tactical one. They had laughed at the Airacobra for 2 years. Now they called it Die kleine Schlange, the little snake. Pokrishkin himself wrote in his journal after that day, "The cobra bites only once. But that bite is enough." The Kuban campaign ended in June 1943. The Luftwaffe withdrew across the Strait of Kerch, abandoning the bridgehead it had sworn to hold. Soviet pilots celebrated not with parades, but with quiet exhaustion. For them, victory meant simply surviving to fight again. In Moscow, few understood what had happened in those skies. But in German intelligence files, one note circulated in red pencil. "The American Airacobra, in Soviet hands, unexpectedly effective. Avoid combat below 4,000 meters." The worst fighter in America had just forced the Luftwaffe to change its tactics. And when the smoke cleared over the Kuban, even the most skeptical commanders finally admitted it. The joke plane had become a weapon of fear. When the dust of the Kuban settled, the statistics spoke louder than propaganda. Between March and June of 1943, Soviet Airacobra units claimed over 600 confirmed kills. For the first time in the war, the Red Air Force had achieved local air superiority over German frontline troops, and it had done so largely with a plane that the Western Allies had already discarded. What began as a logistical afterthought, a few hundred, reject, fighters sent north through Alaska, had become a decisive tool in the hands of the most disciplined Soviet regiments. The P-39's success transformed the balance of power on the Eastern Front. German bomber groups, which once struck with near impunity, now suffered crippling losses. Luftwaffe commanders could no longer rely on low-altitude raids to support ground offensives. Every dive bomber or supply transport risked crossing into a killing zone patrolled by Cobras. This forced a strategic shift. The Luftwaffe began withdrawing bomber squadrons from the southern front, reallocating them to the defense of Romania's oil fields and the crumbling Western theater. The skies over Soviet armies, once ruled by black crosses, slowly turned red. By late 1943, Pokryshkin's 16th Guards Regiment and Rechkalov's 19th Guards had become elite formations. They flew continuous sorties during the Battle of Kursk, intercepting German aircraft attempting to disrupt Soviet tank columns. Combat reports from that period describe P-39's attacking head-on, their cannon shells tearing through Ju-87 formations in seconds. In a single day during the Kursk campaign, Pokryshkin's unit destroyed 19 enemy aircraft, a record that stunned even Soviet headquarters. The regiment received the Order of the Red Banner, and its pilots were decorated personally by Stalin. What made these victories possible was not the machine alone, but the discipline it demanded. The P-39 punished mistakes. It spun violently if pulled too hard. Its nose cannon could jam if fired in long bursts. It rewarded calm, measured flying, the kind of precision Pokryshkin drilled into his men. In the chaos of war, that discipline saved lives. Soviet mechanics learned to keep the Allison engines running in bitter winters and sweltering southern heat. Spare parts were scarce, so they improvised. Engine oil was warmed over open fires. Tires were patched with captured German rubber. Each squadron became a family of pilots and ground crews who understood that the Airacobra, though foreign, had become theirs. By 1944, over 4,000 P-39's were in Soviet service. They flew along the entire front, from the Arctic convoys of Murmansk to the wheat fields of Ukraine. In the north, they hunted bombers. In the south, they escorted Il-2 Sturmovix and broke German fighter screens. Their reputation grew so strong that Luftwaffe radio intercepts began to include coded warnings. Vorsicht, Cobras in der Luft! Caution, Cobras in the air! The Airacobra had also reshaped Soviet pilot training. Pokryshkin's regiment was often rotated to train new units, passing down tactics like height ladder combat layering and fire and dive ambushes. These methods would later influence the entire structure of Soviet fighter operations through the Cold War. By the war's final year, the aircraft once mocked as obsolete had become the foundation of Soviet air superiority. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a Mustang or a Spitfire. It didn't escort bombers to Berlin. But it won the kind of battles that determined the front line: brutal, close-range duels fought in air thick with smoke and flak. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, hundreds of P-39's were still flying combat patrols. Others guarded Moscow, Leningrad, and the Polish front. For many Soviet pilots, the Airacobra was the last cockpit they would ever sit in before peace returned. Some stayed in service even after the war ended. Records show the P-39 remained operational in Soviet training and border defense units until 1949, long after most American-built fighters had been scrapped or replaced. The Western world, busy celebrating Mustangs and Thunderbolts, barely noticed. But in the East, a quiet respect endured. The worst fighter in America had helped win the greatest land war in history. One cannon burst, one frozen runway, one young pilot at a time. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Bell P-39 Airacobra carried two very different legacies, one Western, one Eastern, and both carved by misunderstanding. In the United States, its story ended almost where it began. The Airacobra was quietly retired, replaced by newer, faster, higher-flying designs like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. To the American press, it was a footnote, a flawed experiment that never reached its potential. Aviation magazines labeled it America's worst fighter, citing its poor high-altitude performance, its spin tendencies, its short range. Even Bell Aircraft moved on, designing the P-63 King Cobra as a kind of redemption. In post-war air museums, the P-39 was often absent entirely. Few remembered that thousands had been built. Fewer still knew where most of them had gone. But in the Soviet Union, the same aircraft became something almost sacred. Across airfields from Murmansk to Crimea, rusting Cobras sat in long rows, their olive paint faded but their red stars still bright. Veterans returning from the front would walk among them quietly, touching the wings as if greeting old comrades. Many refused to believe the machines that had carried them through war were obsolete. For Soviet pilots, the P-39 was not just a foreign tool, it was the weapon that had given them equality in the air. Alexander Pokrishkin became a national hero, credited with 59 confirmed victories, most achieved in his beloved Cobra. When he received the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, an honor shared by only 2 others, he personally requested that his P-39, number 100, be preserved for the next generation. It still stands today in the Central Air Force Museum near Moscow. Other pilots wrote about the Airacobra in memoirs and diaries with almost affectionate reverence. They remembered the smell of heated oil in winter, the metallic hum of the mid-engine behind their shoulders, the way the cockpit door closed like a car, sealing them into a small, trusted world. Even decades later, when jet fighters ruled the sky, the veterans spoke of the P-39 not as a machine, but as a partner. It was honest, one said. If you respected it, it respected you. Soviet designers took notes, too. The experience with the Airacobra's tricycle gear, center of gravity balance, and powerful nose armament influenced future domestic fighters, including early MiG models. Engineers quietly admitted that the lessons learned from maintaining thousands of American-built Cobras shaped Soviet aviation more than any captured German aircraft ever had. Meanwhile, in the West, myths grew. Documentaries repeated the tankbuster legend, a distortion born of post-war confusion and mistranslation. Western analysts, unaware of the Airacobra's air-to-air role in Soviet service, assumed its nose cannon had been used to attack German armor. The reality, hidden behind the Iron Curtain, told the opposite story. The P-39's greatest triumphs came not from strafing tanks, but from defending soldiers against German air power. It would take half a century for that truth to emerge. After the Cold War, historians gained access to Soviet archives, combat logs, and gun camera films. What they found was extraordinary. The Airacobra had achieved one of the highest kill-to-loss ratios of any Allied fighter on the Eastern Front. It was not a relic. It was a cornerstone. And yet, the two stories, East and West, never fully converged. In American memory, the P-39 remains an oddity, mid-engine, low ceiling, a machine overshadowed by greater legends. In Russian memory, it's a symbol of partnership, of a strange moment when two enemies of tyranny, half a world apart, built a fighter together and found victory in different skies. The Airacobra became proof that reputation is often just geography in disguise. To the West, it was failure. To the East, salvation. The same aircraft, two histories, two truths. And somewhere between them, under the dust of old airfields and the silence of forgotten hangars, lies the real legacy of the P-39, the fighter that refused to die, and the men who refused to let it. History often decides winners and losers with the wrong yardstick. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was never meant to escort bombers at 30,000 feet or duel over the Channel. Yet that was the scale by which the West measured it, and by that scale, it failed. But wars are not fought on charts. They are fought by men, in places where the air burns with dust, smoke, and fear. Over the Eastern Front, where combat happened barely a kilometer above the ground, the Airacobra became something different, a weapon of survival. It was a fighter that punished arrogance. Those who tried to use it like a Mustang cursed it, those who learned its rhythm turned it into a blade. Soviet pilots discovered that the limitations, mocked in Western reports, were exactly the strengths they needed: speed in a dive, precision in firing, toughness under pressure. There is a quiet poetry in that. A machine born of misjudgment finding purpose in the hands of those desperate enough to understand it. When the war ended, the world moved on. Jets replaced pistons. Nations buried their dead and built myths in their place. Somewhere in that process, the Airacobra was forgotten, its name fading from Western textbooks even as its silhouette endured in Soviet museums. But for the men who flew it, the sound of the Allison engine behind their shoulders never left them. They remembered the vibration before a cannon shot, the smell of cordite, the brief silence when the enemy fell away. They remembered how it felt to fly the aircraft everyone else laughed at, and win. The P-39's story is not about triumph or failure. It's about perspective, about how truth in war depends on where you stand, and how high you fly. Measured by the wrong sky, it was a disappointment. Measured by the right one, it was redemption. And somewhere, in the cold air above the Kuban or the gray clouds of Murmansk, that little American fighter still turns its propeller, still leveling its nose toward the enemy, proving that sometimes, the most underestimated weapon in war is understanding.